They say the most painful moment in a woman's life isn't when she's betrayed, but when she realizes she's allowed it to happen for too long. Cassandra Vale signed the divorce papers in absolute silence, while her husband's mistress wore her silk dress right in front of her. No tears, no screams, only the sound of the pen scraping against the paper, sharp, cold, and decisive, like a knife. That was the night Cassandra Vale died, and it was also the night a completely different woman began to be born from those ashes. If you've ever felt erased from your own life, stay. This story is for you. Leave the name of the city you're reading in the comments. I want to know how far my story has traveled in this world. And don't go anywhere, because the best part is yet to come. The rain came down hard that night, the kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as a tack, driving sideways off the East River and slamming into the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Cross penthouse like it had a personal grudge. 43 floors above Manhattan, the city dissolved into smeared lights and black water. Below, yellow cabs crawled through streets that had become shallow rivers. Up here, the air smelled like expensive whiskey, cold marble, and something Cassandra Vale could only describe as the particular stench of a dying marriage. She had been standing at the kitchen island for what felt like hours, though the clock on the Gaggenau oven said it had only been 11 minutes since she walked in and found them. 11 minutes since her entire architecture of 12 years had cracked clean through. She wasn't shaking. That surprised her. She had always assumed that when the moment finally came, and some quiet part of her had always known it would come, she would fall apart. Scream, throw the Waterford crystal, do something violent and ugly and human. Instead, she just stood there, gripping the edge of the marble island with both hands, staring at the divorce papers her husband had somehow managed to prepare, notarize, and lay out with remarkable efficiency, as if dismantling a marriage was just another item on his Tuesday calendar. Adrian Cross stood across from her in a charcoal Brioni suit, his tie loosened but his posture still that of a man entirely in command of the room. He was 41 years old, still handsome in the architectural way that money and discipline could manufacture, with the kind of jaw that photographed well and the kind of eyes that had stopped seeing Cassandra somewhere around year 7. His phone sat face down on the island beside the papers. He hadn't picked it up once. She noticed that. He was giving her his complete attention, which somehow made everything worse. Sienna Hart was arranged on the cream sectional sofa in the living room behind him, making a studied effort at appearing casual. One leg tucked beneath her, a glass of red wine balanced on her knee. She was 26, with the particular kind of beauty that looked curated rather than inherited, and she was wearing Cassandra's ivory silk robe, the one Cassandra had bought in Milan 4 years ago, on a trip she and Adrian had taken to celebrate his company's IPO. She had been wearing that robe when they ordered room service at 2 in the morning, and Adrian had laughed at something she said. Actually laughed. The real version, the one that reached his eyes. She had thought that was the best night of her life. Now Sienna's red-tipped fingers were curled around the sash of that same robe like a flag planted in conquered territory. Cassandra looked at her for a long moment. Sienna met her gaze with the careful blankness of someone who had rehearsed this scene. Then Cassandra looked away, because looking at Sienna wasn't interesting anymore. The anger she expected to feel had curdled into something quieter and more final, something that didn't have a name she'd ever needed before. "The terms are fair," Adrian said. His voice was the measured boardroom version, not the version he used when he was drunk and wanted to fight, not the version from the early years when he used to talk to her in the dark before either of them fell asleep. This was the voice he used with lawyers and subordinates. "The settlement is more than generous. The townhouse in the West Village is already transferred to your name. There's a separate account with—" "I know what the papers say," Cassandra said. Her own voice surprised her. It was steady. It had no performance in it. Adrian paused. Something shifted briefly behind his eyes. Not guilt, not quite. More like the look a chess player gets when a piece moves in an unexpected direction. "Then you understand there's no reason to draw this out." She looked at him. Really looked at him. This man who had once, on a boat off the coast of Maine, with nothing around them but open Atlantic and the sound of her laughing, pressed his forehead against hers and said, "I would burn down the world before I let you cry." She had believed him. That was her crime and her stupidity, and her 12-year sentence all wrapped into one sentence she had memorized without meaning to. "No reason?" she repeated. "Cassandra." And there it was. The slight edge in his voice, the thread of impatience beneath the controlled surface. Adrian Cross did not like waiting. "This is the cleanest outcome for both of us." Outside, a crack of thunder rolled across the island and shook the windows. The lights flickered once. On the sofa, Sienna uncrossed her legs and recrossed them. Cassandra reached out and picked up the pen. She didn't let herself think about the boat off Maine. She didn't let herself think about the penthouse they had designed together, arguing cheerfully over tile samples and the precise shade of white for the living room walls, a conversation that had seemed important at the time. She didn't think about the miscarriage she'd had at 32, the one they never fully discussed, the wound they had silently agreed to route around until it became the wall between them. She didn't think about any of it. She put the pen to paper and she signed her name in the same precise, slightly left-tilted script she had used since grade school, Cassandra Vale. And then, for the last time in her life, Cross. She set the pen down. She pulled the ring off her left hand. 12-year-old white gold with a 3-carat radiant cut stone that had cost more than most people's cars. She held it for exactly 1 second, not from sentimentality, but because it was heavier than she remembered. And then she placed it beside Adrian's whiskey glass with a small, precise click. She turned and walked toward the elevator. "The movers will coordinate with you," Adrian said behind her. Still the boardroom voice, already moving on. "You can take whatever you need from the personal items." She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened immediately. She stepped in without turning around. The last thing she saw as the doors closed was Sienna Hart, rising from the sectional, moving toward Adrian with the unhurried confidence of a woman claiming a room that already belonged to her. Adrian didn't look at the elevator. Didn't look at Cassandra one more time. He picked up his phone from the island, unlocked it with his thumb, and started scrolling. The doors shut. Cassandra leaned against the back wall of the elevator and closed her eyes as the car dropped 43 floors. The rain hammered the building's glass exterior, and the elevator made its quiet hydraulic sigh. And she breathed slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her therapist had taught her years ago when the anxiety was bad. She had stopped seeing that therapist after Adrian told her it was unnecessary. That should have been a sign. There were a lot of signs she had chosen not to read. When the lobby doors opened onto Park Avenue, the rain hit her like a cold hand across the face. She had no coat. She had left the building with her keys, her phone, her wallet, and the clothes on her back, a charcoal sheath dress that was now plastered to her skin within 30 seconds. She stood under the building's narrow canopy and looked out at the drowning street and thought, with a strange and detached clarity, "I have nowhere to go." The townhouse was hers on paper now, but it wasn't home. It had never been home. It was a property. She didn't hail a cab. She started walking. 3 blocks, then 4. The rain came down so hard she couldn't tell if she was crying or just soaked. She suspected it was just the rain. The grief she expected hadn't arrived yet. It was somewhere behind her, following at a distance like a slow-moving storm system, and she was too far ahead of it right now to feel it properly. What she felt instead was something stranger and more disorienting, a terrible, vertiginous lightness, as if 12 years of carefully maintained structure had been a weight she had not understood she was carrying until the moment it was gone. She ended up in a bar on Lexington she had never been to before. Dark wood, low lights, nobody she recognized. She ordered bourbon, which she didn't usually drink, and sat at the bar and stared at the amber in the glass while the rain continued its siege outside, and the bartender had the professional decency to leave her alone. That was where she met Elena Vasquez, not that night. That night, Cassandra drank 2 bourbons and took a cab to a hotel and slept for 14 hours and woke up feeling scraped hollow. But Elena was a regular at that bar, a compact, sharp-edged woman in her late 40s who worked in private security consulting and had the manner of someone who had seen enough of human behavior to have stopped being surprised by it. Cassandra returned to that bar 3 nights later, and 3 nights after that, and on the 4th visit, Elena sat down next to her and said, without preamble, "You're either running from something or you're waiting for something. Which one?" Cassandra considered the question seriously. "I don't know yet." Elena had studied her with the flat professional assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating risk. When you figure it out, she said, placing a business card on the bar, call me. The card had a name, a phone number, and nothing else. Cassandra called 3 weeks later. She didn't have a plan at that point. She had a townhouse she barely slept in, a settlement account she hadn't touched, a vague and angry energy with nowhere to go, and the growing awareness that the woman she had been for the past 12 years, careful, contained, expertly positioned as Adrian Cross's most valuable social asset, was a construction. A careful architecture of small compressions and adjustments, each one individually reasonable, each one a further erasure of whoever Cassandra Vale had been before she became Cassandra Cross. She was 37 years old. She had an undergraduate degree in economics from Columbia that she had never once used professionally because Adrian's career had required her to be available, mobile, and decorative. She had managed the social infrastructure of a billion-dollar brand without a title or a salary or any acknowledgement that the introductions she'd made, the dinners she'd engineered, the crises she had quietly diffused at cocktail parties had been work. Real, skilled, consequential work. Elena recognized this before Cassandra had fully articulated it to herself. You've been functioning as a C-suite asset without C-suite authority, Elena said during their second meeting over coffee in a Soho cafe. You understand how power moves through rooms. You just haven't been permitted to move it yourself. And you're going to help me with that, Cassandra said. It came out flatter and more skeptical than she intended. Elena didn't smile. I'm going to give you access. What you do with it is your problem. Elena's world was the one that existed in the seams between legitimate and illegitimate power. The zone where political operators, private security firms, high-end fixers, and the outer edge of organized money all bled together. It was a world Cassandra had existed adjacent to for years, at Adrian's side in boardrooms and backrooms, without ever looking at it directly. Now Elena walked her into it from the front door. The first 4 months were education. Cassandra learned things she couldn't have learned in any institution. She learned which city councilman had second phones. She learned the financial architecture of 3 different shell company structures that funneled real estate money through Caribbean LLCs. She learned the particular social grammar of rooms where powerful men believed they were invisible. The way they relaxed, the things they said, the hierarchies they displayed without realizing they were displaying them. She was good at reading these rooms. Better than she'd known. Adrian had always positioned her as ornament. It turned out she had been functioning as an intelligence-gathering asset without either of them being fully aware of it. She moved through Elena's world quietly, absorbing, saying little. She took no money, sought no status, made no large moves. She was building something internal, a new structural understanding of how power actually worked as opposed to how it was supposed to work. It was during this period, at a private fundraiser in a Tribeca loft that Elena had brought her to as a guest, that she first encountered the name Lucien Moretti. She didn't meet him that night. He wasn't there. But 3 separate conversations referenced him in the same hour. Once obliquely, twice with the studied casualness people used when they wanted to demonstrate their proximity to something dangerous. He was described in these conversations through absence and implication. Before Moretti's people bought that building, the kind of problem that gets Moretti's attention. One man lowered his voice to say the name and then looked around the room reflexively, as if the walls might report back. Who is he? Cassandra asked Elena on the way out. Elena looked at her sideways. The answer to that question is not a casual piece of information. I'm not asking casually. Elena was quiet for half a block, walking in the cold with her hands in her coat pockets. Then she said, he controls the financial infrastructure of the East Coast underworld, not the street-level operation, the architecture, real estate, logistics, political insulation. Families that used to war openly now all operate under a structure that he manages. He doesn't make threats. He restructures incentives. She paused. He's been operating in public sight for years without anyone in law enforcement being able to build a case. Not because he's careful, though he is, but because he's genuinely useful to too many people who would rather keep him operational than see him prosecuted. How old is he? 44? Never married? No public relationships? Appears at 2 or 3 events per year, always with a specific purpose, never for visibility. She glanced at Cassandra again. Why are you asking these specific questions? Cassandra didn't answer right away. She was thinking about what Elena had said. He restructures incentives. It was the language of economics applied to the architecture of fear. She found it, against her better judgment, interesting, because the two conversations tonight that referenced him both involved people Adrian does business with, she finally said. Elena stopped walking. Cassandra stopped a step later and turned to look at her. "Which people?" Elena asked. Her voice had shifted register slightly, still controlled, but differently weighted. Cassandra told her. Elena listened without expression and then said, "Don't do anything with that, not yet. Do you understand me?" Cassandra understood, but she filed it away in the careful internal ledger she had been building over the past months. The one no one could see, in the room no one could enter, in the part of herself that 12 years of compression had left untouched and intact and quietly furious. She first met Lucien Moretti 8 months after signing the divorce papers, at a private dinner at a Georgian townhouse in the West 50s that Elena had arranged with a terseness that suggested she was still not entirely comfortable with the introduction. The dinner had 12 guests, 2 former federal officials, a shipping magnate, an art dealer whose primary business was an open secret, and various others whose precise roles were difficult to classify and probably deliberate. Lucien Moretti arrived 7 minutes late, which Cassandra would later understand was a calculated precision rather than a discourtesy. He was tall, not in the way that made itself obvious immediately, but in the way you noticed when he crossed a room, a quality of vertical presence that had less to do with actual height than with how he carried himself. Dark suit, no tie. Dark eyes that moved across the room once on entry, quickly and completely, in the unhurried manner of someone conducting a security sweep without appearing to. He was not, she noted, conventionally handsome. His face was too angular for that, the jaw too sharp, a scar along his left cheekbone that his barber's careful work did nothing to conceal. He looked like someone who had navigated a great deal of difficult terrain without softening on the way through. He sat at the opposite end of the table from Cassandra. Through the first course, she didn't look at him directly. She was aware of him the way you're aware of a structural element in a room, not aesthetically but architecturally, as something that organized the space around it. He spoke twice during dinner, both times briefly and in response to direct questions, and both times the table shifted attention toward him with the specific quality of people in the presence of authority they hadn't quite granted consciously. After the main course, in the interval when guests moved from table to bar, he crossed the room and stood beside her without preamble. "Elena tells me you spent 8 years managing the social infrastructure of Cross Technologies," he said. His voice was low, with a slight texture to it, Italian origin compressed by 2 decades in New York. "Elena talks too much," Cassandra said. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "She also says you have a specific memory for financial architecture and a particular talent for reading rooms." "Elena's been generous." "She's been accurate. I don't do generous." He looked at her with the direct attention of someone with very little interest in social performance. "How much of what your former husband was doing in the Cayman structure did you actually understand?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Cassandra kept her expression exactly where it was. "That's a very specific question." "I ask specific questions." "Adrian kept me out of the financial structures." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him for a moment. Really looked at him, the way she had looked at Adrian in the elevator lobby before everything ended, taking inventory. And what she saw in Lucien Moretti's face was not warmth, and it was not the performance of warmth. It was attention, clean, direct, undiluted attention. He was looking at her the way people very rarely looked at her, not at what she represented or what she was adjacent to or what use she might be to the room. At her. "I understood enough," she said carefully. "Enough to know it wasn't legal." "Enough to know it wasn't entirely legal," she corrected. "I didn't know the specific mechanisms." "But you suspected." "I made choices about what I examined and what I didn't examine," she said. "I'm not proud of that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the most honest answer I've received at a dinner table in 3 years." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. He looked out across the room for a moment, toward the window where the city spread its cold November light across the glass. And then he said, almost as an aside, "Adrian Cross has been structuring debt through your former friend Marcus Bale. The structure is going to collapse inside 8 months. When it does, 4 other entities go down with it. 2 of those entities have obligations that intersect with mine. He paused. I'm going to need someone who can navigate that collapse without appearing to have any stake in it. Cassandra processed this. Why are you telling me this? He looked back at her. Because you're the only person in this room with a plausible reason to be involved in Adrian Cross's financial affairs, no legal exposure to the current structure, and the social credibility to move in those circles without raising flags. You want to use me. I want to propose an arrangement with mutual benefit, he said. There's a difference. A fine one. Yes. He reached inside his jacket and produced a plain white card, just a phone number, handwritten. He set it on the bar in front of her. Think about it. You have a week. After that, the arrangement becomes less useful to both of us. He left the bar. He said his goodbyes in the room with the efficiency of a man who had learned to exit before he became comfortable anywhere. Cassandra stood at the bar and looked at the card and held her bourbon glass and listened to the conversation around her continue, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't just reoriented something fundamental. She called the number 4 days later. That was the beginning. What followed was not a romance, not at first. It was more like the careful assembly of a functional alliance between 2 people who had each, for different reasons, developed the habit of operating in isolation. Lucien Moretti was not a man who trusted quickly or displayed warmth as a social strategy. He was clear, direct, occasionally blunt in a way that Cassandra found, after 12 years of Adrian's studied charm, almost physically refreshing. He said what he meant. He did not manage her mood. He did not perform interest. He didn't feel or withhold opinions, he did. Over the following 3 months, Cassandra worked with him on the cross-adjacent financial matter, navigating conversations, gathering specific information through her network of social contacts, presenting herself in Adrian's world as a merely bitter ex-wife with no particular agenda. It was not a comfortable performance. She was genuinely bitter. But bitterness, she found, was an excellent mask for precision. And in the in-between spaces of that work, the late evenings in Lucien's office on the upper floor of a building on West 57th that looked from outside like an investment firm and from inside like a room where someone had made serious decisions for a long time, something else was happening, something neither of them had scheduled. He asked questions about her life that were too specific to be social. She answered them with less guardedness than she'd planned. He told her one evening, with no particular context, about his father's death when he was 19. The way it had reorganized everything he'd understood about how the world worked, about protection and its price, and who was permitted to provide it. She recognized something in that story that she didn't have words for immediately. Later, she understood what it was. The moment when someone's history showed you the shape of their damage, and the shape matched something in your own. He was sitting across from her in his office, both of them with coffee that had gone cold, the city invisible below a low cloud cover outside. When she realized she had been talking for 40 minutes about her mother's particular brand of elegant, crushing disapproval, the way it had trained Cassandra to seek approval from exterior sources because the interior source had been quietly hostile since childhood, and that Lucien had been listening with his full attention, not with the polite half-attention of someone waiting for the conversational space to talk about himself. She stopped mid-sentence. You don't actually care about any of this. He looked at her. Why would I be here at 11:45 at night listening to it if I didn't? She didn't have an answer for that. The thing that had been building quietly between them didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with theater. It arrived in small, factual increments. The way he began to position himself physically between her and exits, in rooms full of unpredictable people, without comment. The way she found herself reading news items that she thought would interest him and sending them at 7 a.m. before she'd fully registered what the impulse meant. The way he looked at her sometimes across a table, not with desire exactly, with something more comprehensive than desire. Something that included desire, but was also composed of attention, and something that looked increasingly like relief. She was not naive enough to call it love. Not yet. Not when everything around her was still tactical. Not when she was still some functional nights waking in the townhouse's too large bedroom, thinking about Adrian's face when he slid those papers across the marble and feeling something that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific grief of realizing you had wasted good years of yourself on a person who had always intended to discard you, and that you had helped him do it. But she was also not naive enough to dismiss what was happening. She had stopped being naive as a survival strategy. Whatever this was with Lucien Moretti, it was real. It was the most real thing in a year of reconstruction, and it scared her, which meant it mattered. 3 weeks before the Black Orchid auction, in his office, with the coffee cold again, and the city dark and close outside, Lucien said, "I want you there that night." She knew which night. She'd heard about the auction. Everyone in this world had. As what? He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached inside the inner pocket of his jacket and set a small black box on the desk between them. She looked at it, then at him. "As my wife," he said. He said it with the same steady directness he said everything, not as a performance, as a statement of intent. "I understand if the answer is no. I understand there are a dozen reasons the answer should be no, but I want you to have the full picture before you decide." She opened the box. The ring inside caught the desk lamp and threw a tiny shard of light across the ceiling. "The full picture," she repeated. "It puts a target on you," he said. "My name isn't a comfortable shelter. It's a specific kind of exposure. There are people who would use you to reach me. There are complications you're not currently carrying that you would be carrying. And the other side of the picture." His jaw shifted slightly. "No one touches what's mine," he said. "Not ever. Not Adrian Cross. Not anyone with a grievance against me. You would be the most protected person in this city." She looked at the ring for a long time. Outside, the November wind pushed rain against the glass in irregular bursts, and the city below pulsed with its indifferent electricity. And somewhere across the island, Adrian Cross was probably asleep in the penthouse she had shared with him for 9 years, not thinking about her at all. She thought about the morning after she'd signed the papers. She thought about walking in the rain. She thought about Elena's question, "Are you running from something or waiting for something?" She picked up the ring. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Then she looked at Lucien Moretti, this careful, dangerous, precise man who had looked at her with more genuine attention in 3 months than Adrian had managed in the final 7 years of their marriage. And she said, "Tell me exactly what the night of the auction is going to look like." And Lucien Moretti, for the second time in her experience, allowed the corner of his mouth to move in something approaching an actual smile. "The entire room is going to be there," he said, "including Adrian Cross." Cassandra set the ring on her finger. It fit exactly. Mata. Phần 2 sẽ tiết lộ điều xảy ra khi những cánh cửa của Black Orchid Auction mở ra, và cả Manhattan phải đối mặt với một sự thật mà không ai trong số họ chuẩn bị để chứng kiến. The ring fit exactly. That was the part Cassandra kept coming back to in the 3 weeks between Lucien's office and the night of the Black Orchid auction. Not the weight of the decision, not the tactical calculus, not even the particular quality of silence that had filled the room after she slid it onto her finger. Just that. The ring fit exactly, as if it had been made for her hand rather than acquired for a purpose, which she suspected was not a coincidence, and which told her something specific about the kind of man Lucien Moretti was. The kind who measured things before he committed to them, who did not leave fit to chance. She wore it in private for 3 weeks. At home in the West Village townhouse, where she was still sleeping in the guest room because the master bedroom felt too large and too loaded, with a history she was still metabolizing. In Elena's car on the way to the 2 preparatory meetings Lucien had arranged. In front of the mirror at 6:15 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come, and she stood in the bathroom in the dark, studying her own face, trying to locate in her reflection the woman who had stood at a marble kitchen island and signed her name in silence, and finding her increasingly difficult to recognize. Elena had said almost nothing when Cassandra told her, just looked at the ring for a long moment with the expression of a woman rapidly recalculating a column of figures, and then said, "You understand what this makes you." "I understand what it makes me in his world," Cassandra said. "That's not the same as understanding everything." "No," Elena agreed. "It's not." She picked up her coffee. "Are you frightened?" Cassandra thought about it honestly. "Not of him." "Of what then?" "Of the version of myself that isn't frightened of this," she said. Elena had no response to that, which was, in its own way, an answer. The night of the Black Orchid auction arrived on a Thursday in late November, and Manhattan dressed itself accordingly. The kind of cold that cut through good coats, and the kind of sky that pressed down low and dark on the city like a lid on a pot. The auction was held in the Callaway, a private venue in Midtown that occupied the upper 4 floors of a pre-war building and which, for approximately 9 months of the year, did not officially exist. Cassandra had heard it referenced twice before in her years as Adrian's wife, always in the category of things that existed between an invitation and a secret, the kind of event that powerful people did not discuss except with other powerful people who already knew. She dressed at the townhouse, alone. She had refused Elena's offer to send someone. She needed the hour of silence, the specific privacy of preparing herself without an audience, the ritual of it. She had bought the dress 4 days earlier at a boutique in the meatpacking district where the sales associate had said nothing beyond what was strictly necessary and had looked at the black satin gown with the professional approval of someone who recognized a decision rather than a purchase. It was not a dress that apologized for itself. Long, fitted, with a neckline that was precise rather than revealing, and a quality of surface that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, so that under certain conditions she seemed to be wearing darkness itself as a second skin. She pinned her hair up herself, which she had always been better at than anyone she'd paid to do it. She put in the diamond drops, her own, from before the marriage, one of the few pieces she'd owned outright, and looked at herself in the long mirror behind the bathroom door and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, I am not pretending tonight. This is something else. The car arrived at 8:45. Not a limo. Lucien didn't do limos, she had learned. A black town car, current model, no plates that meant anything obvious, driven by a man named Dario, who had been with Lucien for 11 years and spoke approximately 12 words per interaction and radiated the specific competence of someone who had navigated complicated situations at high speed in the dark. Lucien was in the back seat. He looked at her when she got in, one of those complete rapid assessments that she'd initially found disconcerting and had come to understand was simply how he processed the world. And then he said, You look like someone who's made a decision. I made the decision 3 weeks ago. People make decisions and then unmake them. He said it without inflection, not an accusation, a statement of observed fact. Not me. She settled into the seat beside him. Not this one. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved past in fragments of light and shadow as Dario navigated south through Midtown. Then Lucien said, Adrian is confirmed. He'll be there with Hart. The name landed without surprise. Cassandra had known. She'd factored it in. Who else? Marcus Bale, the senator from Connecticut who's been laundering goodwill through Adrian's Clean Energy Initiative. 2 of my business counterparts from the outer structure who need to see this happen in person to believe it. He paused. And a federal intelligence officer who has been building a case against Adrian's Cayman structure for the past 14 months and who will be present tonight under the cover of a political fundraiser contact. Cassandra turned to look at him. You're accelerating the collapse. I'm providing it an audience, he said. The collapse was already structural. I'm simply ensuring the right people are present when the first piece falls. She absorbed this. Then, what do you need me to do? Be visible, he said. Be completely and obviously yourself. Do not perform anything. Do not manage the room the way you used to manage rooms for him. He looked at her directly. You are not there tonight as an asset. You are there as my wife. There is a specific difference. I know the difference. Tell me. She looked at him. The city slid past. As an asset, I'm a tool with a function. As your wife, I'm a statement. She paused. A statement that every person in that room will read as a message from you, directly. He held her gaze for a moment. And what will the message say? That you chose her, Cassandra said. That he lost her. And that the distance between those 2 facts is the exact measure of what he threw away. Lucien was quiet. Then he looked forward, at the back of Dario's head, at the city. Yes, he said simply. The Callaway's entrance was on a side street, a door that looked like a service entrance and was staffed by 2 men who wore suits that did not hide what was underneath them. Dario pulled the car to the curb and was out and had Cassandra's door open before she'd fully registered the stop. Lucien came around the car and stood beside her on the sidewalk in the cold. And for one moment, just one, they were simply 2 people standing on a dark New York side street with the wind moving between the buildings and the noise of the city wrapped around them like a coat. Then he put his hand against the small of her back, and she felt the warmth of it through the satin and the temperature of the November air and the weight of whatever was about to happen, all at once, and she breathed in and out once deliberately, and they walked toward the door. The rooms inside the Callaway were hung with deep burgundy and black, lit by chandeliers that were old enough to have been sourced from actual European estates rather than manufactured to suggest it. The crowd occupied several interconnected spaces: a main salon where the auction would take place later in the evening, a bar area that ran the length of the eastern wall, a terrace behind glass that looked down over Midtown's dense grid of light and had been closed for the cold but was visible through the floor-to-ceiling panes like a stage set waiting for its scene. The room smelled like old money, which was a specific combination of good wine and expensive fabric, and the underlying anxiety of people who had a great deal to protect. The crowd was perhaps 120 people. Cassandra did not do a rapid inventory. That would have been visible, and she was not there to perform competence. She simply moved into the room beside Lucien and let her eyes adjust, the way you adjusted to any new environment, taking in the whole before the parts. She felt the shift happen in waves. The nearest cluster of guests, 3 men in late middle age, deep in a conversation about something that immediately became less important, noticed Lucien first, in the way that all rooms with a certain density of power noticed Lucien first. The recognition moved through the conversation group with the precise economy of a disruption in water. And then one of the men glanced at Cassandra, and something changed in his face. He knew who she was. She could see him processing the specific cognitive collision of who she had been: Adrian Cross's ex-wife, the invisible woman, the woman the whole city had watched walk away from the Park Avenue penthouse and into nothing, and who she was apparently now. The wave moved outward. She didn't watch it happen directly. She felt it through peripheral data, the small redirections of attention, the conversations that slowed or stopped, the heads that turned and then turned away and then turned back. Beside her, Lucien's hand remained at her back, not gripping, not steering, simply there. A fact and a declaration. A man named Richard Holt, whom Cassandra recognized from 3 different charity circuit dinners as one of Adrian's longest-standing social satellites, was the first person to approach them. He was 60, red-faced, with the over-groomed look of someone who had recently started spending more on his appearance than his age warranted, and he came forward with the specific energy of a man who needed to understand what he was looking at before he could calibrate his behavior. "Lucien," he extended his hand. "Didn't know you were in attendance tonight." Lucien shook it with the brevity of a transaction. "Richard." Holt's eyes moved to Cassandra, a beat too long. "Cassandra," he said. "You look—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't realize you two—" "Richard," Lucien said with a mildness that was more silencing than volume, "you'll have to excuse us." They moved deeper into the room. Cassandra kept her posture and her pace and her expression exactly where she wanted them and said quietly, from the side of her mouth, "He's going to find Adrian inside 6 minutes. 4, Lucien said. It was 3.5. She saw Adrian before he saw them. He was near the bar with Sienna, both of them with champagne, both of them in the particular performance mode of a powerful couple at a prestigious event. Sienna's hand on his arm, Adrian's profile angled to catch the room's light at its most flattering, the unconscious staging of 2 people who had decided their relationship was itself a public event. He was wearing a navy suit she recognized. She had helped him choose it for a London meeting 2 years ago, waiting outside the fitting room at a tailor on Savile Row while he deliberated between 2 shades of the same blue. She noticed that she felt almost nothing looking at him. Not numbness, something more active than that. A kind of finality that had the clean texture of a healed-over wound. Not painless, but closed. Then Sienna saw them first. Whatever Sienna said to Adrian, Cassandra didn't hear it. She watched it happen from 30 feet away. The slight tightening of Sienna's grip on Adrian's arm, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture from relaxed to alert, the half-second delay before he turned to look. And then Adrian Cross looked across the room and saw his ex-wife standing beside Lucien Moretti, with Lucien's hand at her back and a ring on her left hand that caught the chandelier light in exactly the way he would have known how to read. His face did not collapse. He was too controlled for that, but the blood moved out of it. Not dramatically, just enough. Just the specific subtraction of color that happened when the body processed something the mind was refusing to accept. He looked at the ring, then at Lucien's face, then at Cassandra's face. And then he looked away, which was the worst thing he could have done, because looking away meant he didn't know how to look at it yet. Sienna's champagne glass tilted at an angle that suggested her hand had briefly stopped working. Then Lucien said quietly, "Let's get a drink." They moved to the bar on the eastern wall. The bartender, young, observant, practiced at the particular attentiveness of someone who understood the social voltage in the room he worked, poured without being asked, a bourbon for her, and something neat and dark for Lucien. Cassandra took the glass and held it, and breathed normally and said nothing. Lucien stood beside her with his shoulder angled slightly in front of hers, which was not a gesture he'd made deliberately, or at least not one he'd made consciously. She noticed it anyway. 3 minutes later, Sienna came to the bar. Not with Adrian. Alone, which was the first interesting piece of tactical information the evening had provided. Sienna ordered a fresh glass of champagne, and while the bartender poured, she positioned herself 2 feet from Cassandra with her gaze directed toward the room's main entrance and said, without turning her head, "I didn't expect to see you here." "You mean you didn't expect to see me anywhere," Cassandra said. A small silence. Sienna picked up her champagne. "You seem well." "I am well." Another silence. Then Sienna turned slightly, and Cassandra saw that under the careful architecture of the woman's face, the contouring, the composed expression, the social armor, there was something raw, not guilt. Sienna was not, she suspected, a person who processed guilt in any conventional way, but something adjacent to unease. The particular unease of someone who had made a calculation that was suddenly revealing itself to have been built on incomplete information. "He talked about you," Sienna said, quietly, almost involuntarily, as if the sentence had escaped before she'd decided to say it. Cassandra waited. "Not the way you'd want to know about," Sienna continued. "Not—" She stopped, recalibrated. Her eyes moved briefly to Lucien's profile and then away. "He said you'd never be able to exist outside his structure, that you'd built your entire identity around being his." She paused. "He said it like he was certain." "He usually was," Cassandra said. "I know." Sienna's jaw moved. That's the thing about certainty. It doesn't leave room for revision. It was, Cassandra realized, the most honest thing Sienna Hart had ever said to her. The recognition of it. The unexpected, uncomfortable symmetry of it. 2 women standing at a bar in a room full of dangerous money, both of them having organized significant portions of their lives around the same man's fixed ideas about who they were, settled over her like cold water. She looked at Sienna for a moment. "Did you know?" she asked. Not with anger, with the simple directness of someone who wanted a factual answer. "From the beginning. Did you know he was married?" Sienna met her eyes. "Yes." The word landed cleanly, without the defensive packaging Cassandra had expected. She nodded, once, and turned back to her drink. "Cassandra," Sienna said. She didn't answer. "I'm not—" Sienna stopped, started. "I'm not happy." Cassandra looked at her sideways. Sienna's face was carefully assembled, and beneath it she looked in this particular light, at this particular angle, very young and very tired. "Then you're learning," Cassandra said. She picked up her drink and moved away from the bar. She found Lucien near the entrance to the terrace, speaking in low, unhurried Italian with a man she didn't know. Compact, 50s, with the broad stillness of someone who had spent years learning to be underestimated. Lucien glanced at her as she approached, and she saw the question in it, brief, unspoken, and gave him the fractional nod that had already developed, without their designing it, as a shorthand between them. "I'm fine. Continue." The man in Italian finished what he was saying, and Lucien replied with 2 sentences, and the man nodded and withdrew into the crowd. Lucien turned fully toward her. "Sienna," she said. She came to the bar. His expression didn't change. "What did she want?" "I'm not sure she knew." Cassandra looked out through the terrace glass at the city below, the grid of it, the cold, brilliant, indifferent geometry. "She said he was certain I couldn't exist outside his world." Lucien said nothing. "I think she's starting to understand something about what she chose," Cassandra said. I don't feel what I expected to feel about that. What do you feel? She thought about it. Tired, she said, and accurate. Like I finally understand the geography of something I've been standing inside for years. He was quiet for a moment. Then Adrian crossed the room toward them. He came directly, with the stride of a man who had decided not to think any further before acting, which was, she recognized, Adrian at his most dangerous. Not when he was calculating, but when his calculation had failed and he was operating on something more primitive. He was holding a fresh whiskey and his jaw was set, and he looked at Lucien first, not at Cassandra, which was its own kind of message. I didn't realize you two had a relationship, he said. He kept his voice at the social register, pleasant and level, but the effort of it was visible to her in the particular compression around his eyes. Most things about me aren't your business, Lucien said pleasantly. He made no move, no adjustment of posture. He simply stood and looked at Adrian with the complete calm of someone for whom this was not a stressful development. Adrian's gaze moved to Cassandra. Can we talk? We're talking, she said, privately. No. A brief charged silence. Someone nearby glanced over and redirected his attention with visible effort, the way you looked away from a street altercation without wanting to be noticed looking away. Cassandra, Adrian said, and now the social register slipped slightly, a thread of the real beneath it. I need to understand what this is. It's what it looks like, she said. You're good at reading rooms, Adrian. Read this one. His jaw tightened. He looked at the ring again. She watched him do it, watched him process the specific texture of the ring, its quality, its size, the deliberateness of it, and watched something harden behind his eyes. How long has this been? Enough, Lucien said. Just the word. Quietly. But the air around it changed, the way air changes around something that has mass. Adrian stopped speaking. His body registered it before his intellect did. The slight backward shift of weight, involuntary, the held breath. Lucien looked at him without expression. You're going to want to think carefully about the next sentence. Adrian's mouth worked. She could see him behind his eyes, making the calculation, the furious, humiliated calculation of a man who had spent years being the most powerful person in every room he entered and who was currently processing the experience of not being that. The whiskey glass in his hand. The room around them, carefully not watching. Sienna somewhere behind him, doing God knows what. We built something together, Adrian said finally. His voice had changed register again. Lower, stripped of social performance, aimed directly at Cassandra. 12 years. You were part of everything I built. Everything you built, she said. That's the sentence I've been waiting 12 years to hear you say. His expression fractured slightly. That's not Adrian. She said his name quietly, without anger. With the particular exhausted precision of someone finishing an argument they've been having internally for years. You slid those papers across the counter like a business transaction. You had your mistress in my robe. You didn't look at me when I walked to the elevator. You didn't come after me. You didn't call. She paused. In 9 years, you never once figured out that I was the architecture. Not the decoration, the actual structure. She looked at him steadily. You can be angry about what I've built since, but you don't get to be surprised by it. The room was not, technically, silent, but the specific 6 feet of air around them had developed the acoustic quality of held breath. Adrian stared at her. Something moved through his face that she couldn't fully classify. Rage, and beneath it something worse, something that might have been recognition. The particular recognition of someone who had just heard, too late, and with absolute accuracy, a true account of their own failure. Then Marcus Bale appeared at Adrian's elbow. Marcus Bale was 53, broad, with a fixer's instinctive radar for a situation that needed diffusing. He had been Adrian's financial architect for 8 years. He looked at the assembled configuration, Adrian's face, Cassandra's posture, the diamond on her left hand, Lucien Moretti standing quietly like a structural element in the room, and performed a very rapid assessment. Adrian, Marcus said carefully, touching his arm. Senator Whitmore wants a word. Adrian didn't move immediately. He held Cassandra's gaze for 1 more second, and she held it back, and she did not look away, and did not soften, and did not offer anything because there was nothing left to offer and she had known that for a long time before tonight made it official. Then Adrian let Marcus redirect him away into the crowd, and the air in that section of the room resumed its normal temperature and consistency, and Lucien's hand came back to the small of her back, and she breathed out slowly through her nose. "You're shaking," Lucien said very quietly. "Adrenaline," she said, "not fear." "I know the difference," he said. "So do you." She picked up her drink from a passing tray and drank from it and looked at the room. The swirl of money and power and its attendant anxieties moving through the burgundy-lit space, and felt something she hadn't felt in 12 months of reconstruction. Not triumph. Not yet. Something before triumph. The clean, cold sensation of being exactly where she had navigated herself to be, through her own work and will and the particular wreckage of her own history, and finding that the ground beneath her feet was solid. 20 minutes later, at the far end of the bar, Marcus Bale took out his phone and made a call. She watched him do it from across the room, watched him move out of the main salon into the corridor toward the coat check, phone pressed to his ear, body angled away from the room. Watched him talk for 90 seconds, then look at the phone, then look back toward the main room with an expression she recognized. She recognized it because she had seen it on Adrian's face once, 4 years ago, when a deal he'd been building for 8 months had collapsed in a single phone call. The specific expression of a man who has just learned that the ground he was standing on was not what he thought it was. She set down her drink. "Lucien," she said quietly. He was already watching Marcus. "I see it." "What just happened?" He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, still watching Bale, "The federal investigation team ran an emergency warrant tonight. They had enough without me." He paused. "They've frozen the Cayman accounts." She processed this. "Tonight, during this event, it appears so." He finally looked at her, and she saw in his face the specific expression of a man who has planned extensively for a range of outcomes and is now recalibrating to one that arrived slightly ahead of schedule. "This changes the shape of the evening." "How?" "Marcus Bale is going to tell Adrian in the next 3 minutes. When Adrian knows, he's going to look for the nearest explanation for how federal investigators located the specific account structures." He looked at her steadily. "The nearest explanation is standing in this room." The cold moved through her slowly and completely, like ice water rising. "He'll think it was me," she said. "He'll think it was both of us." Lucien's voice was flat and level. "That we came here tonight not only to be seen, but to be present when it happened. To watch." "Did you know the warrant was tonight?" He looked at her. A moment of absolute weighted silence. "Lucien," she said, "did you know?" And across the room, she watched Marcus Bale cross back into the main salon, touch Adrian's arm, and lean in close. She watched the color leave Adrian Cross's face for the second time that evening, and she watched him turn, slowly, with the deliberate movement of a man who has just been told exactly who put the knife in, and look across the room directly at her. The expression on his face was not grief, and it was not humiliation, and it was not the cold indifference she had last seen across the marble kitchen island 12 months ago. It was something she had never seen on Adrian Cross's face before. It was fear. And Lucien Moretti, beside her, had not yet answered her question. Lucien Moretti had not yet answered her question. That was the fact she kept returning to, not Adrian's face across the room, not the freeze moving through the Cayman accounts in real time, somewhere in a federal database she would never see. Not the specific texture of the fear she had just watched cross the face of a man who had never previously experienced fear in her presence. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But the fact that sat at the center of everything, the one that had its own gravitational pull, was the 3 seconds of silence from the man standing beside her who had an answer and was choosing the timing of it with the same precision he chose everything. "Lucien," she said again. Lower this time, not a request. He turned from Adrian's direction and looked at her fully. His face was composed, not closed, not performing, composed in the way of someone who has arrived at a moment they prepared for and is now moving through it with the deliberateness of a person who understands that the next 30 seconds will determine a great deal. "Walk with me," he said. "Answer the question." "Walk with me first." She looked at him for one hard second. Then she moved. Not because she was complying, she had stopped complying with men as a reflex 8 months ago, but because she understood from the specific quality of his stillness that what he was about to tell her required the architecture of a private space. And because part of her, the part that had been building this internal ledger for 11 months, the part that filed everything away and cross-referenced it against everything else, already suspected the shape of the answer. They moved through the room toward the corridor that led to the private lounge at the back of the Callaway's 4th floor. Lucien's hand was not at her back this time. He walked beside her with 3 inches of air between them, and she felt the difference of it. The withdrawal of that physical assurance, the return of a careful distance, and it confirmed the shape of what was coming before a single word had been spoken. The lounge was unoccupied. Dark leather furniture, a bar cart that had been restocked and not yet touched, windows that looked north toward the park, a room for private conversations, which was probably why Lucien knew where it was without looking for it. He closed the door behind them, and the noise of the main salon reduced itself to a low, muffled current of voices and crystal. He stood near the window. She stood near the door, deliberately, with 8 feet between them, because she needed the distance to think, and she needed to be able to see his whole face. The federal team didn't find the account structure independently, he said. They were given a specific architecture map, account numbers, transfer sequences, the name of the shell company in the Caymans that processed the pass-throughs. He paused. That map was provided 6 weeks ago through a confidential informant channel. The room was very quiet. The informant, Cassandra said. He met her eyes and held them. The informant was Elena Vasquez. The silence after that had a different quality than the silence before it. It was the silence of a structural failure, the particular absence of sound that follows the crack before the thing actually falls. Cassandra's hands were completely still at her sides. She was aware of this with the detached precision of someone monitoring their own body from a slight distance. Her breathing was even. Her face was, she was almost certain, composed. The inside of her chest was doing something different, a slow, cold collapse, a compression, as if all the air in a room had been removed without warning, but nothing on the surface of her showed it, and she was not going to let it. "Elena," she said. "Yes." Elena was working with federal investigators. "Elena has been working with federal investigators for approximately 2 years, Lucien said. His voice was even, factual. He was not cushioning it with inflection, and she understood that was its own form of respect, the refusal to soften something that didn't deserve softening. She was recruited by the Financial Crimes Division after her consulting firm was investigated for tangential involvement in a money transfer case. She agreed to provide intelligence in exchange for immunity and the continued operation of her business. Cassandra absorbed this in the specific way she had learned to absorb things that detonated on impact, by letting the force of it move through her rather than trying to stop it, by not tightening against it. "She introduced me to you," Cassandra said. "Yes." "She brought me into your world." "Yes." The full geometry of it assembled itself in her mind with a cold and terrible clarity. Elena at the bar on Lexington, the night after the divorce. The business card placed with the timing of a woman who had been waiting for the right candidate to walk through the door. The 2-year recruitment, the patient cultivation, the careful management of Cassandra's trajectory through this world, not as a friend trying to help a woman rebuild, but as an operator executing a long-game intelligence strategy. Using Cassandra's access to Adrian's world, her social credibility, her legitimate grievance, her devastation, as tools in a federal investigation that had been designed around Lucien Moretti's financial empire long before Cassandra Vale signed a divorce paper in a penthouse in the rain. "She used me," Cassandra said. The sentence came out flat and precise. "To get to me," Lucien said. "Yes. She used my marriage falling apart." Cassandra's voice didn't change register, didn't rise. This was somehow worse than if it had. The flatness of it, the scrubbed clean quality of words from which all affect had been removed because affect could not survive what they were carrying. "She was there that night. I went back to that bar 3 nights later, and she was there because she made sure she was there. Almost certainly. The dinner where I met you, she arranged that." "Yes. The work I did on this cross-financial matter, the information I gathered, the rooms I moved through." She stopped. Then, "Was any of it real? Did any of it come from me, or was all of it structured by her to produce a specific outcome?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. The information you gathered was real. The access you had was real. What you chose to do with it, the way you read those rooms, the conversations you navigated, that was yours. Elena opened the door. You walked through it as yourself. That's a carefully constructed reassurance. It's accurate. Lucien. She said his name and it came out with an edge on it she hadn't intended or planned. Don't manage this conversation. Don't optimize what you give me. Tell me the full measure of it. He looked at her steadily. Elena's intelligence to the federal team identified 3 things. The Cayman account structure I'm adjacent to through 2 intermediary entities, the Marcus Bail transfer mechanism, and the names of 4 city officials whose cooperation Adrian had purchased. He paused. The first item is the one that concerns my operation directly. The federal team has been building toward a secondary investigation, beyond Cross, beyond bail, that uses the Cayman adjacency to draw a line toward my financial architecture. The cold in her chest deepened. They're not just after Adrian. They were never only after Adrian. Adrian was the legible target, the one with a public profile and a clean enough paper trail to prosecute conventionally. But he was also the surface. The investigation was designed to use him as a door into deeper infrastructure. He paused. My infrastructure. And Elena used me to get you close enough to... She stopped. Restarted. She couldn't finish the sentence with the word she needed because she still wasn't certain what the word was. And now she wasn't certain that her uncertainty about the word was even her own, or whether it had been cultivated in her by a woman who had understood that Cassandra Vale, hollowed out by betrayal, would be exquisitely susceptible to the experience of being genuinely seen. To establish a documented connection between you and my operation, Lucien said. If the investigation moves to indictment and they need to demonstrate scope, you become part of the evidence architecture. You were inside the work. You gathered intelligence. You were present at meetings that can be characterized as operational. And as my wife, he said the word with a precision that made it land hard. You become evidence of my operational integration at the highest personal level. The room tilted slightly. Not physically, but the way the room tilted when the fundamental premise of something turned out to be its opposite. She needed me to marry you, Cassandra said. Lucien said nothing, which was an answer. Elena needed me close enough to you, trusted enough by you, to become a vector. She was thinking aloud now, working through the architecture of it the way she had learned to work through financial structures, tracing the design backward from the outcome to reveal the intent beneath it. If I'm your wife, I'm not just an associate. I'm irrevocably integrated, and I have no federal protection because nobody offered me any. I wasn't recruited as an informant. I was recruited as an unwitting participant, Lucien said quietly, in legal terms. In legal terms, I'm the civilian wife of an organized crime figure who voluntarily assisted in intelligence gathering operations, and who can now be leveraged as either a cooperating witness or a co-defendant, depending on which is more useful to the prosecution. She looked at him. The 8 feet between them felt like a much larger distance. That's what she built. Yes, Lucien said. And for the first time since she'd known him, she heard something beneath the controlled surface of his voice. Not guilt. She wasn't certain guilt was a register he moved in, but something that had the quality of an acknowledgement of cost, of having understood a risk and chosen to run it, and now watching the specific human weight of that choice arrive. You knew, Cassandra said. I suspected Elena's dual operation 6 weeks ago. When I confirmed it, the warrant timeline was already in motion. I couldn't... You knew, she said again, and this time the flatness was gone, and something real came through it, something that had heat and edges. You knew what she was when you let me keep believing she was my friend. You knew what I was being positioned for, and you let me put that ring on and come into this room and... What would you have done? He said. Not defensive, asking, the genuine question. I would have... She stopped. What? He said. Left? Gone back to the townhouse and done what with it? Gone back to a life that had already been dismantled? You had nowhere that wasn't compromised, Cassandra. Elena had positioned herself as your only door into any world that wasn't Adrian's. If I had told you 6 weeks ago, what door were you going to walk through? She hated that it was a real question, She hated that it didn't have an obvious answer. She hated the specific architecture of it. The way both of them, for different reasons, had run the calculation of what she would have done with the information and arrived at the same answer, which was that there was no clean version of this, and there had never been one, and the window for a clean version had closed the moment Elena Vasquez sat down beside her at a bar on Lexington and placed a business card on the counter. "You should have told me," she said, "not for strategy. You should have told me because I was walking into this without the full picture." "Yes," he said, simply, without construction around it. She looked at him. "That's it? Yes? You're right. I should have told you." He held her gaze. "I made a calculation that the information would destabilize something I wasn't willing to risk destabilizing. That was my choice, and it was wrong, and I'm telling you so directly because you asked me to be direct." The heat behind her eyes was not tears. It was something drier and more combustible than tears. Something that had been building since the moment Marcus Bale's face had changed across the room and had now found the specific kindling it needed. "You decided what I could handle," she said. "You looked at me and you decided what version of the truth I was ready for." She paused. "Adrian used to do that." The sentence landed. She watched it land. Lucien absorbed it without movement, without expression, but she saw it reach him. In the almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles along his jaw, the single slow breath he took through his nose. "That," he said quietly, "is not what I did. It looks the same from here." "It's not." His voice was still level, but the flatness had changed quality. It had acquired a specific, concentrated weight, like pressure building behind a contained surface. "Adrian managed your information to keep you small, to keep you dependent, to maintain a structure that served his purposes and required your ignorance to function." He took one step toward her, not closing the distance fully, but reducing it. "I kept information from you to protect an operation that had already been compromised before you entered it. Those are not the same act. The result is the same. I'm standing here without the information I needed." "Yes," he said, "and I'm standing here telling you everything now, without condition, because you asked me to. Because you deserve the full picture even when the full picture is this." He looked at her steadily. "That's the difference." She wanted to reject this. She wanted the clean moral geometry of it being identical to what Adrian had done, because that would be simpler and grief moved more easily through simple structures. But she was not a simple person, and she had stopped accepting simple structures when they were convenient lies, and the honest inventory of the distinction he was drawing was that it existed. It was real. It didn't absolve him, but it was real. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, a gesture she didn't plan, an involuntary self-containment, and then lowered it and said, "What happens now?" "The federal team will move on Adrian formally within 72 hours. The Cayman accounts are frozen, which destabilizes Bale's structure, which creates enough pressure that Bale will cooperate to minimize his own exposure. Adrian will be indicted within the month." Lucien paused. "The secondary investigation, the one pointed at my operation, is less certain. Elena provided an architecture map, but maps require corroboration to become prosecutable. They need a witness who can testify to direct operational knowledge." She looked at him. "They need you," he said. The room held perfectly still around that sentence. Elena's entire 2-year project, she said slowly, was building a witness who had enough personal grievance against Adrian Cross to be credible, enough genuine proximity to my operation to be useful, and enough legal exposure from her own participation to be leverageable into cooperation. She paused. "She built me as a perfect cooperating witness." "Yes." "And if I don't cooperate?" "Then you carry the legal exposure of the participation without the protection of the cooperation agreement." He said it without inflection. "Co-defendant status in a RICO-adjacent proceeding is not a position I would recommend." "You're describing 2 doors," she said. "Cooperate with federal investigators and testify against your operation, or refuse and face prosecution." "Those aren't the only 2 doors," he said. "Then tell me the third." He looked at her for a long moment. "There's a third investigation. One Elena doesn't know about because it was initiated separately by a different federal division, based on intelligence that didn't come from her." He paused. "An investigation into Elena Vasquez's own financial operations. The immunity she was granted covered her conduct during the 2 years of her cooperation agreement. It did not retroactively cover 8 years of consulting work that preceded it. Work that involved, among other things, the facilitation of asset transfers for 3 clients who were subsequently sanctioned by the Treasury Department. Cassandra stared at him. You've been building a case against Elena. I've been aware of the exposure for 4 months. I've been ensuring the relevant documentation reached the right people for 6 weeks. While she was building a case against you. Parallel operations are not unusual in this world. She let out a short, involuntary sound. Not a laugh. Something smaller and more private than a laugh. The auditory equivalent of a person registering an irony too dark to process cleanly. You were both using each other, she said. And both using me. Elena was using you. What I was doing with you was something else. What were you doing with me? He held her gaze. And for the first time in the months she had known him, she saw something unguarded in his face. Not the control releasing, but something beneath the control surfacing through it. Something that had been there for a while and was simply now no longer entirely containable by the architecture he maintained around himself. Building something, he said, but that I didn't entirely plan and haven't entirely categorized, and which is the reason I made the wrong call about the timing of this information, because I didn't want to watch it change your face. He paused. It changed your face anyway, which is what I deserved. The 8 feet between them was still 8 feet. She did not cross it, and neither did he, and the distance had a different quality now. Not the cold distance of betrayal, not yet, but the charged and difficult distance of 2 people who have just told each other very hard truths and are still determining what survives them. Then the door to the lounge opened, not slowly, not with the tentative quality of someone uncertain of what they were walking into. It opened with the directness of someone who knew exactly what they would find. Elena Vasquez stood in the doorway. She was wearing charcoal, a structured blazer, dark trousers, her silver-streaked hair pulled back with its characteristic severity. She looked at Cassandra first, and then at Lucien, and her face moved through something rapidly, 3 or 4 things in close succession, too fast to fully identify, before settling into the particular expression of a woman who has made her calculations and arrived at the threshold of acting on them. I wondered when you'd pull her out of the room, Elena said. Her eyes were on Lucien. Her voice had shed the warmth that had deployed for 2 years of Cassandra's acquaintance, the way a coat comes off in a warm room, completely, without ceremony, revealing what was underneath. Elena, Cassandra said. Elena looked at her, and in her face was something that was not, despite everything, entirely cold. Something complicated. Something that might have been the remains of an actual feeling, experienced and then subordinated to a purpose, and now surfacing in a room where the purpose had arrived at its conclusion and the feeling had nowhere left to hide. You were supposed to stay in the main room, Elena said. You were supposed to be visible when the warrant news reached Cross. That was the sequence. You planned my blocking for the evening, Cassandra said. Like a scene. Everything is a scene. Elena's chin lifted slightly. You know that by now. You've been learning it for 11 months. You taught me. Cassandra heard her own voice, steadier than she expected, stripped of everything except the thing underneath everything, which was cold and clear and paying close attention. Was any of it... She stopped, made herself continue. Was any of it real? The bar on Lexington? The coffees? The things you told me about how power moves? She paused. Were you ever actually my friend? Elena's jaw moved. A small movement. What I told you was true, she said. Every piece of it. That's what made you useful. And what made you useful was that you were real, Cassandra. You're the most genuinely capable person I've worked with in 20 years. The grief was real. The anger was real. The intelligence was real. She paused. I just knew how to point it. At him, Cassandra said. At the structure that needed dismantling. Elena's voice shifted. Something almost evangelical moving beneath its surface. Something that had clearly been living in her for a long time. You know what Lucien Moretti's financial architecture does to real institutions? To real prosecutors who try to build real cases and find every piece of evidence rerouted through 3 shell structures before they can get a warrant signed? To city officials who take his insulation money and vote in ways that protect his operation at the direct expense of... Don't. The word came from Cassandra, and it was quiet and it was complete. Don't perform the justification for me. I've heard you construct arguments. I know how you build them. Don't do it in this room." Elena stopped. "You used my pain," Cassandra said, "as a raw material. You identified a woman at the lowest point of her life, and you made yourself into the thing she needed most, and you pointed her like a weapon." Her voice was still level, but it had acquired something beneath the levelness, a resonant frequency, low and constant. "I can understand the operational logic. I can even understand the federal mandate. What I cannot process, what I am standing here unable to make fit into any framework I have, is that you looked me in the eyes for 2 years and called it friendship." Elena held her gaze, and for one moment, one unguarded moment, something crossed her face that was not operationally useful and could not be categorized as a tactic, something that was simply the expression of a person who has heard an accurate account of the harm they've done and has no argument against it. "I'm sorry," she said. And it was not, Cassandra was certain of this, with the precision of someone who had spent 2 years learning to read Elena Vasquez, a performance. It was exactly what made it worse. "The federal team is outside," Elena said after a moment. "Not here for an arrest, here for an initial conversation. They want to talk to you." She looked at Cassandra. "About a formal cooperation arrangement, immunity for your participation, full protection from the secondary investigation." She paused. "It's a good offer. It's the cleanest door out of this." Cassandra looked at her. Then she looked at Lucien. He was watching her with the still, complete attention he brought to everything. No direction in it, no steering. Just watching her stand in the wreckage of everything she had built over 11 months and make the calculation that no one else could make for her. The cooperation arrangement was the clean door. It was the rational door. It was the door that a woman with self-preservation instincts intact and no particular loyalty to a criminal empire would walk through without hesitation. She looked at the ring on her left hand. She looked at the man across the room who had kept a truth from her and had told her so directly and without construction when she demanded it, which was more than anyone else in this story had done. She looked at Elena Vasquez in the doorway, this woman who had built her, genuinely built her, and simultaneously used her as instrument, and who was now offering her an exit that was also a dismantling of everything she'd become. And she thought about the woman who had signed the papers in silence, the woman who had walked into the rain with no coat, the woman who had sat at a bar and drunk bourbon she didn't like and waited for something to tell her what she was. That woman was gone. What stood in her place was not a product of Elena's construction or Lucien's world or Adrian's failure. What stood here had been assembled in the spaces between all of them, in the private room no one else could enter, out of the specific materials of her own wit and wreckage, and the 12-year compression of everything she had refused to be. And she was not, she understood now with complete clarity, going to let anyone in this room decide what she did with it. "Tell the federal team," Cassandra said, though, "that I'll need 48 hours. Elena's expression shifted. "That's not how this—" 48 hours, Cassandra said again. "Or they can explain to their supervisors why they burned a 2-year operation by not giving their central witness 2 days to retain independent legal counsel." She looked at Elena steadily. "That's not a negotiation. It's a statement of what happens next." Elena looked at her for a long moment, then at Lucien, then back. 48 hours, she said. "After that, the offer has conditions attached." She left. The door closed. The room was quiet. Cassandra stood in the middle of it with the ring on her finger and the wreckage of every assumption she had carried into this building spread around her like the aftermath of something structural and final. She was not the woman who had walked in. She was not certain yet what woman was standing here instead. But she was going to find out in the next 48 hours, and she was going to do it on terms that belonged entirely to her. She looked at Lucien. "I need," she said carefully, "to know everything. Every piece of it. The full architecture of your operation, the full scope of the federal case, the full measure of Elena's treasury exposure, and whatever third option you haven't told me about yet." She held his gaze. "Because there is one. I can see it in your face. And if you keep it from me for 1 more hour, I will walk out of this building and cooperate with every federal investigator in the lobby, and you will spend the next decade explaining your financial structure to people with subpoena power." Lucien looked at her, a long measuring look. The look of a man who has just understood, with complete and perhaps somewhat overdue clarity, exactly who he is dealing with. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me standing." And outside the lounge door, somewhere in the burgundy-lit rooms of the Callaway, Manhattan continued its expensive and indifferent business, while inside, the woman who had signed her name in silence 11 months ago prepared to rewrite every term of "Tell me standing." He told her standing. It took 40 minutes. Lucien did not sit either. He stood near the window with the city behind him and talked in the measured, unornamented way he did everything. No excess, no performance, no softening of the hard edges. And Cassandra stood 8 feet away and listened with the complete absorptive attention she had spent 11 months training into something sharper than it had ever been before. The third option was this: Elena Vasquez's treasury exposure, properly documented and delivered to the right desk at the right time, was enough to void her cooperation agreement retroactively. Without Elena's testimony and the intelligence architecture she had built, the secondary investigation, the one pointed at Lucien's financial operation, collapsed to circumstantial. The primary case against Adrian stood independently. Vale would still cooperate on the primary. Adrian would still be indicted. The federal team got their public prosecution, their headline, their demonstrable win against visible corruption. What they lost was the deeper infrastructure case, the one that required Elena's 2 years of groundwork to make prosecutable. The delivery mechanism for Elena's treasury exposure required someone with clean hands, someone with no documented involvement in Lucien's operation who could present the material as a concerned private citizen acting on information received through legitimate channels, someone whose identity, when it emerged, and it would read as credible rather than retaliatory. Someone who was, on paper, exactly what Cassandra Vale appeared to be. An ex-wife with a legitimate grievance against corrupt financial structures, recently educated in how those structures actually worked. She absorbed this in silence. Then she said, "You need me to be the clean hands." "Yes." "To protect your operation." "To neutralize a specific threat to it, yes." "And the immunity question. If you deliver the material as a private citizen acting independently, you're not a cooperating witness in the federal proceeding. You're a source. The legal exposure from your participation in the earlier work doesn't attach to the act of providing information about Elena's separate conduct." He paused. "You would need independent counsel to structure the delivery correctly. You have someone. I have someone." She looked at him for a long time. "And if I do this, if I become the clean hands that neutralize Elena's case and protect your architecture, what exactly am I then? What does that make me?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with the specific attention she had come to understand as his version of honesty, the undecorated, full-contact version of looking at someone. "It makes you someone who made a choice," he said. "A specific, informed, unconditioned choice, with the full picture in front of you, which is more than anyone in this story has offered you until tonight." She breathed in slowly, breathed out, looked at the ring. "You understand that I'm not doing this for your operation," she said. "I'm not doing it for Adrian's prosecution or federal case architecture or any of the strategic geometry you've spent months managing." She looked up at him. "I'm doing it because it's the only door that belongs to me, the only one I'm walking through on my own terms." "I know," he said. "Then we understand each other." "We've understood each other for a while," he said quietly. "I've just been slow to act on it correctly." She crossed the 8 feet between them then, not rushing it, not performing it, simply closing a distance that had been a statement and was now no longer necessary. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face, the angular face with the scar she had stopped noticing weeks ago, because it had become simply part of the geography of someone she knew, and she said, 48 hours starts now." "Yes," he said. "Then let's go back into that room and finish the evening." They went back into that room and finished the evening. That was Thursday. By Saturday morning, the city was cold and gray and moving with its usual indifferent momentum, and Cassandra was sitting in the office of a lawyer named Daniel Rice on the 31st floor of a building on 6th Avenue, drinking coffee that was better than it had any right to be in a law office, while Rice, 58, trim, with the particular unhurried intelligence of someone who had spent 3 decades finding the precise legal seam in situations that appeared seamless, Read through the documentation Lucien had provided on Elena's treasury exposure. Reese read without expression. He turned pages with the careful economy of a man who understood that the weight of what he was reading required its own pace. When he finished, he set the pages down and looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 seconds, and then looked at Cassandra. "This is enough," he said. "Presented correctly. How long to structure the delivery? If we move today, I can have the submission ready by tomorrow morning. The treasury contact I would use is someone who will receive this without broadcasting it up the chain until the filing is complete." He paused. "There will be a response from the federal team. When they understand what's happened to their corroborating witness, there will be a period of significant pressure directed at you, personally and legally." "I know. And you're prepared for that." "I'm prepared for what comes after it," she said. "The pressure itself is just weather." Rice looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had represented a great many people in difficult circumstances and was recalibrating his initial read of the person across from him. "All right," he said. He picked up his pen. "Let's begin." They worked through Saturday and into Saturday night. She didn't sleep. She went back to the townhouse at 2 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water she didn't drink, and her phone face up on the table, and the city going about its 3 a.m. business outside the windows. A cab, a distant siren, the particular silence of a residential street in the hours when even the insomniacs had given up. She sat with the full weight of what was in motion and let herself feel it because she had learned, in 11 months of reconstruction, that not feeling things didn't make them smaller. It just made them structural. It made them walls. She thought about her mother. She thought about the particular voice her mother had used when Cassandra was 12 and had won an award at school and had come home wanting to share it, and her mother had looked at the certificate and said, "Don't let it go to your head." She thought about how that voice had become interior, how she had internalized it so thoroughly that for 20 years she had been the first person to diminish her own accomplishments, to route around her own capability, to find the flaw in the win before anyone else could point it out. She thought about Adrian learning that voice from her, learning that she would do the deflation herself, that she didn't need external diminishment because she came pre-equipped with her own. She thought about Lucien saying you were the architecture, not the decoration. She thought about how those words had moved through her differently than any compliment she could remember. Not as flattery, not as the kind of affirmation that needed to be doubted, but as a structural observation, a reading of blueprints, someone looking at what she had actually built and naming it accurately. Her phone lit up at 3:17, a text from a number she didn't recognize, 2 words, "They know." She sat with that for 10 seconds. Then she called Rice. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. "The federal team made contact with Elena," he said before she could speak. "She told them about the treasury documentation. She doesn't know the full extent of what we have, but she knows enough." He paused. "They're going to accelerate. They may move on a preliminary injunction to freeze your ability to file independently." "How long do we have?" "Hours. Maybe less." His voice had shed its daylight unhurriedness. Underneath it was something focused and fast-moving. "I need you back here at 6 a.m. We're filing at 7 when the Treasury Division opens." "I'll be there at 5:30. She hung up. She stood up from the kitchen table. She looked at the townhouse around her, the walls she'd chosen not to paint, the furniture she'd chosen not to replace, the accumulated hesitancy of a woman who had not yet decided if she was staying, and she felt with sudden and complete clarity that she was done being hesitant about any room she occupied. She went upstairs. She slept for 90 minutes exactly and woke before the alarm. She was at Rice's office at 5:22. The filing went in at 7:04. Rice had a contact at Treasury who received it at 7:09 and confirmed receipt at 7:14. By 7:30, they were sitting in Rice's office drinking the good coffee again and waiting, and the waiting had the specific quality of the seconds after you've thrown something that can't be caught. A total, irreversible commitment to the trajectory you've set in motion. The federal team's response came at 8:50 in the form of 2 agents who arrived at Rice's building and were informed by the front desk that Daniel Rice was with a client and unavailable. They left a card. Standard procedure. The card meant they wanted a conversation, which meant they hadn't yet determined whether the conversation would be cooperative or adversarial, which meant Rice's filing had landed with enough weight to require reassessment. At 9:15, Cassandra's phone rang. Elena. She looked at the name on the screen. Rice looked at her. She picked it up. Don't say anything actionable, Rice said quietly. She put it to her ear. Elena. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then Elena's voice, stripped of its warmth, stripped of its operational smoothness, carrying something underneath that Cassandra had never heard from her before, which was the sound of a person whose architecture has just been structurally compromised. You filed on me. Yes. You understand what you've done. I understand exactly what I've done. Another silence. Longer. Cassandra heard Elena breathe, heard the specific quality of controlled breathing from someone managing a significant internal situation. The Treasury exposure is real, Elena said. I'm not disputing it, but the timing of this filing with your husband's name attached to the documentation source. My independent counsel filed it, Cassandra said. I'm a private citizen acting on information received through my own channels. The documentation source is clean. She paused. You know it's clean, Elena. You trained me well enough to know how to make something clean. A sharp sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a curse. Something involuntary and uncontrolled, which from Elena Vasquez was as startling as a shout. I did train you well, she said. The anger in it was real. Underneath the anger was something else, something that might, in different circumstances, have been pride. I trained you too damn well. Yes, Cassandra said. You did? She paused. I'm sorry it went this way. I mean that. Not for what I filed, for what you built between us and what it actually was. I'm sorry for that version of it. Elena was quiet. Then, this isn't over. I know, Cassandra said, but it's different now. She ended the call. Rice was watching her. How are you doing? Ask me in 12 hours, she said. She found out at 11 a.m. that Adrian had been served. She found out not from a news alert, but from a text from a number she recognized as belonging to Marcus Bale, which read only, He's been served. I'm cooperating. For whatever it's worth, I'm sorry. She looked at the text for a moment and felt nothing particularly complex about Marcus Bale's apology. Marcus Bale had built Adrian's illegal financial architecture with full knowledge of what it was, and had done it for money and self-advancement over 8 years. His apology was a transactional courtesy extended to someone he perceived as having won a situation he had helped create. She didn't respond. At noon, Rice took a call that lasted 6 minutes and came back to where she was sitting with the expression of a man revising a column of figures upward. The Treasury Division has referred Elena's case for formal review, he said. That triggers an automatic stay on her cooperation agreement pending the outcome of the review. The federal team's secondary investigation against Moretti's operation is, for now, without its corroborating witness. The air in the room shifted slightly, not dramatically, but shifted. For now, she said, formal review takes 6 to 18 months. During that time, the case against Moretti's operation is effectively frozen. The primary Adrian prosecution continues independently. He looked at her steadily. You've created a specific window. How wide? Wide enough, if the window is used correctly. She understood what he wasn't saying. The window was for Lucien, for the architecture of his operation to be restructured around the specific vulnerabilities that Elena's documentation had exposed, for the seams that had been identified to be sealed. Whether Lucien used that window intelligently, whether the restructuring was sufficient, whether the federal case could be rebuilt from scratch, when Elena's review concluded, none of those outcomes were within Cassandra's control, and none of them were her responsibility. She had opened the window. What happened inside it was someone else's work. She was closing her own. She left Rice's office at 12:30 and walked south through Midtown in the cold. No particular destination, just the physical need to move through space after a night and morning of compressed static intensity. The city was doing its Saturday thing, slightly more chaotic than a weekday, slightly less purposeful, tourists and residents and delivery infrastructure all operating on crossing vectors. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets and her face into the wind and breathed the cold air in and felt it move through her lungs and thought about nothing in particular, which was a luxury she had not allowed herself in 11 months, and which felt, for 10 minutes, like the specific relief of putting something heavy down. Then her phone rang. Not Elena, not Rice. Adrian. She stopped walking. A woman behind her detoured around her without breaking stride, the unremarkable urban accommodation of one pedestrian to another's sudden stillness. She looked at Adrian's name on the screen. She thought about not answering. She thought about what she would have done 11 months ago. The woman at the kitchen island, the woman in the rain. Whether that woman would have answered and what she would have said and how her hands would have shaken. She picked up. Cassandra. His voice was not the boardroom voice. It was not the drunk, furious voice. It was a third voice she had heard from him very rarely, stripped of its performances, carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has just had a large and structural thing happen to them and has not yet assembled the resources to manage how it sounds. I've been served. I know. Marcus is cooperating. I know. A beat of silence. She heard him breathe. In the background of wherever he was, his attorney's office probably, or the penthouse, with its marble surfaces and the city 43 floors below, she heard nothing. No sienna, no ambient activity, just the specific quiet of a man sitting with the wreckage of something he'd constructed over years and could not put back. "Did you do this?" he said. She thought about this clean answer. She thought about what was technically accurate, what was legally defensible, what was strategically prudent. She thought about Rice's voice saying, "Don't say anything actionable." And then she thought about 12 years of carefully managed answers, calibrated to avoid Adrian's anger or disappointment, or the specific shift in his temperature that meant she had said something wrong, and she decided for the last time and absolutely finally that she was done managing her answers for Adrian Cross. "No," she said, "you did this. Over 8 years of choices I watched you make and said nothing about. The federal investigation found your structure because you built it in ways that could be found." She paused. "I didn't build it. I just stopped standing in front of it." A long silence. "Sienna left," he said, quietly, as if this fact had arrived separately from all the other facts, and he was still determining where it belonged. Cassandra said nothing. "This morning," he said. "She took—" He stopped. "She took the things she came with. It was very efficient." The particular exhaustion in his voice was real. She recognized it because she had carried it herself, the night she walked out of the elevator and into the rain. The specific weight of a structure you have built your life around revealing itself as load-bearing in a way you had not understood until it was gone. She felt, standing on a midtown sidewalk in the November cold, something she had not expected to feel about Adrian Cross at this point in the story. Not sympathy, not the kind that excused anything, but recognition. The specific recognition of someone who knew exactly what that weight felt like and was not, in the end, capable of finding any pleasure in watching it land on another person. "Adrian," she said, "get a very good lawyer. Cooperate where you can cooperate. Don't lie to the federal team. They already have more than you think they have." She paused. "And stop building things on structures that require other people's silence to stand." She ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then she kept walking. Lucien was waiting at the townhouse when she got back. Not inside. She had not given him a key, had not been asked for one. He was outside on the stoop, in the November cold, in a dark overcoat, looking at the street with the undemonstrative patience of a man who is comfortable waiting and does not require the environment to accommodate his comfort. He looked at her when she came up the block. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for the half-block she still had to cover, and she was aware of herself moving through the distance between them with a directness she didn't edit, aware of her own stride, the cold air, the specific quality of the afternoon light on the brownstone facades, the way the whole day had a texture of something that had been set in motion and had now arrived at its natural conclusion. She stopped in front of him. "It filed," she said. "I know." He had heard from Rice, presumably, or from someone in his infrastructure who monitored these things. It didn't matter. "Elena's cases stayed." "Yes." She looked at him. "The window you have is real, but it isn't permanent. 18 months at the outside. You need to restructure the 3 exposure points she identified in the Cayman architecture, and you need to do it without using any of the same pass-through entities, because those are what the federal team will rebuild from when the stay lifts." He looked at her. Something in his expression moved. "You identified the 3 specific points." From what you told me Thursday night, yes, it wasn't difficult. She paused. You have good architecture. It just has specific seams. Seal the seams. A moment of quiet between them. The street sounds of the city. A bus 2 blocks north, someone's door closing, the wind in the bare trees that lined the block. He looked at her with the full, undivided attention that she had come to understand was his most basic form of respect. Come inside, she said. There's more to discuss. He came inside. They sat at the kitchen table, the table she had barely used, in the townhouse she had barely inhabited, in the life she had been assembling one piece at a time since the night of the rain. And she put coffee on, and they talked for 2 hours. Not about strategy, not about architecture or federal timelines, or the specific geometry of what had been set in motion. They talked about the things that the past 11 months had been too pressurized, too tactical, too layered an agenda to make room for. About his father again, more fully this time. About her mother, more specifically. About the shape of their respective damages and how they had each, in their own way, made those damages into structures. Him into a controlled and isolated empire, her into a perfected and invisible service, and how those structures had protected them and cost them, and were now, both of them, in the process of being revised. It was the most honest conversation she had ever had at a kitchen table. At 4 in the afternoon, his phone rang. He looked at it, then at her. I need to take this. Take it. He stepped into the hallway. She heard his voice, low, in Italian, for approximately 90 seconds. Then silence. Then he came back to the kitchen doorway and stood there, and his face had the specific quality of a man who has just received information that requires immediate action. What? She said. Adrian Cross made a call this morning, he said, to a man named Victor Hale. Do you know that name? She thought. I've heard it twice. He's in private security, or that's his cover. His actual business is debt resolution, Lucien said, for people who have decided that federal prosecution is preferable to other forms of accountability. He paused. Victor Hale makes problems disappear. He has been paid, as of this morning, to address the specific problem that he has been told created Adrian's current situation. The kitchen was very quiet. He thinks I did it, Cassandra said. He's been told you and I together engineered his destruction. The Cayman freeze, the federal case, all of it. His voice was even. Hale has been provided your address. She looked at the window, the late afternoon light on the townhouse across the street, the ordinary, indifferent beauty of a November Saturday in the West Village. How long? Dario is outside. He has been for the past hour. Lucien's voice did not change register, did not perform reassurance, gave her the facts with the clean directness she had come to rely on. 3 of my people are on the block. Hale hasn't moved yet. We know where he is, but the window before he does is short, she said. Yes, she looked at him. And in the specific quality of this moment, the kitchen, the cold light, the coffee cooling on the counter, the fact of 3 people on her block, and a man somewhere in the city who had been paid to address her, she felt something clarify completely. Not fear. She had said to Elena that pressure was just weather. She had meant it, and she meant it now. What she felt was something sharper and more specific than fear, the absolute, crystalline understanding that she had crossed a threshold from which there was genuinely no return. Not the dramatic threshold of marrying a criminal empire's king in a velvet room full of powerful people. The real threshold, the one made of choice and consequence, and the specific irreversibility of having made yourself into something that other people now considered a threat worth addressing. She was not the woman in the rain. She was not Adrian's invisible architecture. She was not Elena's unwitting instrument or Lucien's strategic asset or any of the things she had been positioned as or conditioned into or built around by the intentions of other people. She was, for the first time in 37 years, simply and completely herself. And herself was standing in a kitchen in the West Village on a Saturday afternoon while a man with a paid brief was somewhere in the city moving in her direction. And she had decisions to make and resources available and a mind that worked with the speed and precision of someone who had spent 11 months training it for exactly this category of situation. She picked up her phone. She looked at Lucien. Call Dario in, she said. I need to know everything about Victor Hale's current location, his method of operation, and the specific nature of the brief he's been given. Not because I'm frightened. She met his eyes. Because I am done being the object of other people's plans. Lucien looked at her for one long moment, and then he called Dario. Dario came through the townhouse door with the particular compact efficiency of a man who moved well in crisis, and behind him came a woman Cassandra didn't recognize. Late 30s, dark-haired, with the alert stillness of someone who processed her environment through its threat vectors before its aesthetics. And the three of them gathered around the kitchen table, and Lucien laid out what he knew about Victor Hale in the flat, factual cadences of a man briefing a team. Hale was 2 miles north. He was alone, which was his preference. He worked in proximity rather than distance, which told you something specific about his methodology. He had been given her address, a physical description, and a brief that his contact had communicated as resolution, which in Hale's professional vocabulary meant a specific category of outcome. The woman, Lucien introduced her as Mara, nothing else, which was enough, spread a city map on the table and put 2 fingers on a point on the west side. He moves on foot in this neighborhood, she said. He uses the grid. He doesn't rush. She looked up. We have maybe 40 minutes before he's in range. 40 minutes. Cassandra looked at the map. She looked at the street geometry, the grid, the blocks, the specific topography of the neighborhood she had been living in for 11 months without fully inhabiting. She looked at the point where Hale currently was, and the point where she currently was, and the distance between them and the options that existed in that distance. He can't be arrested, she said. Not yet. If he's arrested before his brief is formally documented, the connection to Adrian is circumstantial, and Adrian's lawyers will bury it. She looked at Lucien. But if we can get him to make contact through a channel that creates a record, the contact has to be initiated, Mara said. He won't do it in writing. He doesn't have to do it in writing, Cassandra said. He has to do it in front of a witness who has federal credibility. She paused. Elena Vasquez. The kitchen went still. Lucien looked at her with the specific expression of a man watching a movie being made that he had not anticipated and was now rapidly evaluating. Explain. Elena's cooperation agreement is stayed, but it isn't voided. She still has federal standing as an informant on record. If she witnesses Hale making an approach, if she can testify that Adrian Cross hired Victor Hale to intimidate or harm a witness in a federal proceeding, she stopped. That's obstruction. That's a federal charge on top of the existing indictment. And it gives Elena a reason to cooperate that has nothing to do with Lucien's operation and everything to do with Adrian Cross committing a new crime in real time. Lucien was quiet for 3 seconds. You're asking Elena to help you. I'm asking Elena to do what she actually wants to do, which is build the cleanest possible case against Adrian Cross. I'm just redirecting the instrument. She paused. She built me as an instrument. I'm returning the methodology. A very small silence. Then Mara said, That's elegant. It's necessary, Cassandra said. She was already picking up her phone. Someone get Rice on the line. I need to know if Elena picking up her phone right now creates any legal complications for the state agreement. She looked at Lucien. And I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. He looked at her. His jaw was set. His eyes were completely steady. And he said with the unornamented directness of a man who did not say things he didn't mean, I trust you. She called Elena. It rang 3 times, 4. Then Elena's voice, cautious and stripped of its social architecture. Cassandra. I need you, Cassandra said, not for your operation or mine, for something that's happening in the next 40 minutes that you're going to want to be present for. She paused. Adrian hired someone. His name is Victor Hale. He's 2 miles north of my address, and he's moving. If you're in position when he makes contact, you have obstruction of a federal witness. On record. In real time. Silence on the line. 6 full seconds of it. She counted. Then Elena said, Where do you need me? Corner of Bank in Greenwich, 20 minutes. I'll be there in 15. The line went dead. Cassandra set her phone down on the kitchen table and looked at Mara and then at Lucien and felt, moving through her chest, the specific current of someone who has committed completely to a course of action that cannot be undone and is drawing on every resource they possess and knows, with a cold and operational clarity that what happens in the next 40 minutes will determine the shape of everything that comes after. Let's go, she said. They went. The streets of the West Village received them with the ordinary Saturday indifference of a city that has seen everything and is surprised by nothing. and Cassandra moved through them with Dario on her left and Mara 2 steps behind and Lucien beside her. And the cold November air came off the river 3 blocks west and hit her face like a reminder that she was entirely, physically, irreversibly present in her own life. And the distance between where she was and where Victor Hale was closing with every step. And somewhere ahead of her at the corner of Bank and Greenwich, Elena Vasquez was already moving into position. And the whole gathered weight of 11 months of loss and reconstruction and betrayal and choice was arriving right now at the single point where it would either hold or... The corner of Bank and Greenwich was exactly what it always was on a Saturday afternoon in November. A residential intersection in the West Village where the buildings were old enough to have character, and the trees had lost their leaves, and the sidewalk carried the particular mixed traffic of dog walkers and coffee carriers, and people moving between one ordinary errand and another without any awareness that the woman walking toward them from the south was moving through the last 40 minutes of a year-long reckoning with everything she had been and everything she had decided to become instead. Cassandra saw Elena before Elena saw her. Elena was standing at the northwest corner in a charcoal coat with her hands in her pockets and her eyes on the middle distance. And even at 60 feet, Cassandra could read the specific quality of her stillness. Not the stillness of patience, but the stillness of someone actively running calculations while appearing to do nothing. Operational stillness. She had spent 2 years learning to recognize it, and recognizing it now, at 60 feet, on a corner in the cold, she felt the particular complex weight of knowing someone's methodology completely, and having that knowledge coexist with something that was not, despite everything, entirely uncomplicated by loss. Mara peeled off a half-block south and moved to the parallel street through a gap between buildings. Dario stayed with Cassandra. Lucien was 2 steps behind on her left, and she could feel his presence without looking. Had learned the specific quality of air he displaced in a space, the warmth of it, the weight. Elena turned when they were 15 feet out and looked at Cassandra first, then at Lucien, then back. Her face was composed but working underneath the composition in the way of someone who is doing several things simultaneously and keeping all of them contained. "He's on West 11th, Elena said without preamble. "Moving south. My contact at the bureau confirmed the brief. It's intimidation, not terminal. Hale doesn't do terminal unless the brief specifically..." "I know what Hale does," Lucien said quietly. Elena looked at him. A long look, the first fully direct look Cassandra had seen the two of them exchange in the same physical space, and it carried the specific weight of 2 people who had been conducting parallel operations against each other for months, and were now standing on a cold corner in November, performing the strange exercise of provisional alignment. "You have people on the block," Elena said. "Yes. Pull them back 2 streets. If Hale sees coverage before he makes approach, he disappears, and the brief goes cold." She paused. "I need him to make contact in the open, on the street, in range of my recording." Lucien looked at her for one moment. Then he took out his phone and made a 30-second call in Italian. Cassandra heard the cadences of it without the words and looked at the intersection around them. The ordinary Saturday street, a woman with a stroller moving past on the far side, a man unlocking a bicycle from a rack on the corner, and felt the strange double exposure quality of a moment that was simultaneously completely mundane and completely loaded with consequence. Lucien ended the call. "Done," he said. Elena nodded. She looked at Cassandra. "You need to be visible from the end of the block, standing, not moving. He needs to be able to approach you without obstruction." She paused. "And you need to not move when he does." "I know," Cassandra said. "He's not going to pull anything on the street," Elena said. It came out with a precision that was not entirely operational. There was something underneath it that was closer to reassurance, and Elena seemed to recognize this as she said it and tightened slightly around the eyes, as if the impulse toward reassurance was a tell she hadn't intended to show. "His brief is a verbal delivery, a warning. He'll tell you to withdraw from the federal proceedings and provide specific instructions for how to do it. That's the evidence." "Adrian told him I was a witness," Cassandra said. "Witness intimidation on top of the existing indictment. Federal charge, mandatory minimum." Elena's jaw was set. "It's enough to make the original case airtight without needing the secondary investigation. He pleads to avoid trial. The bail cooperation locks the financial structure charges, and the whole thing is resolved inside 18 months. And your state agreement, Cassandra said. My review proceeds independently. The Treasury matter is separate from this. Elena looked at her directly. Whatever happens with the review, I want you to know that the work we did, the intelligence you provided during the 8 months before the auction, none of it is going to be used in a way that creates exposure for you. I'm restructuring my testimony to make that clean. Cassandra held her gaze. Why? Elena was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between the buildings. A cab turned the corner and passed them and left a brief disturbance in the air. Because I used you without your consent, Elena said, and because the legal risk I created for you was a consequence of my operation, not yours. And because... She stopped, started again. Because you were actually my friend. I let it be real, and I should have prevented that from the start, and I didn't. And that was my failure of professionalism, and I'm not going to let you carry the weight of it. She paused. That's the only apology I have. It's the accurate one. Cassandra looked at her for a long time. Elena held the look without flinching. Two women standing on a corner in the November cold with the complicated residue of something that had been real and tactical and damaging and genuine all at the same time, which was perhaps the most accurate description of every significant relationship either of them had ever had. I hear you, Cassandra said finally. It was not forgiveness. It was not the dismissal of the damage. It was the acknowledgement of a true statement, which was all she had to give, and was, she thought, what Elena had actually asked for. Let's finish this. Elena nodded. She moved to a position 20 feet east near the entrance to a building's small courtyard and was still. Dario stayed at the south end of the block. Lucien stopped at the edge of the intersection and looked at Cassandra. I'll be here, he said. She looked at him. His face in the cold light, the angular face, the scar, the dark eyes that looked at her with the complete and unguarded attention she had not understood for 3 months and had understood completely ever since. She wanted to say something, but the sentence she reached for kept dissolving before it assembled, not because the feeling behind it was unclear, but because it was too dense for the available time and the available air and the specific functional urgency of the next 10 minutes. She reached out and touched his jaw briefly with her fingertips. 1 second. Then she turned and walked to the center of the block and stood. She stood on the sidewalk of Bank Street on a Saturday afternoon in November and breathed the cold air and felt the concrete through the soles of her boots. And waited. She was aware of her own heartbeat, not racing, not the panic-adjacent rhythm she had expected, but something more deliberate, like a clock that had been set correctly and was simply keeping time. She was aware of her hands in her coat pockets, the left one with the ring, the warmth of her own palms. She was aware of the street around her with the specific, high-resolution awareness of someone who has trained themselves to read environments and is now doing it automatically. The way breathing was automatic. She had been standing for 4 minutes when she saw him. Victor Hale came from the north, moving at a pedestrian pace that was so precisely calibrated to ordinary that it was itself a tell. The specific absence of any distinguishing quality, the gray coat, the unremarkable build, the face designed by 40 years of deliberate unmemorability to be the face that witnesses could not quite reconstruct. He was 60 feet away when she first placed him. He had not yet seen her. She did not adjust her posture or her position. She waited. He saw her at 40 feet. She watched the recognition happen, a fractional adjustment in his gait, the micro-recalibration of a man who has located his objective and is moving into the final sequence of a professional task. He covered the remaining distance at the same unhurried pace and stopped 3 feet in front of her. Up close, he had the particular quality of someone who had spent a career in the seams of things, eyes that assessed from behind an expression of total neutrality, a stillness that was not passive, but poised. He looked at her the way you looked at something you had been given a description of and were confirming against the description. Ms. Vale, he said. No inflection. A statement of identification. That's not my name, she said. A brief pause. Mrs. Moretti, he said, adjusting without expression. What can I do for you? He looked at her steadily. I've been asked to convey a message, he said. His voice was low, unhurried, carrying the particular professional neutrality of a man who had delivered hundreds of messages and had learned to treat the content as incidental. From a party who has a significant interest in the outcome of certain federal proceedings. The message is that your continued cooperation with the federal investigation into the financial conduct of Adrian Cross and associated entities would be, he paused, with the precision of a man selecting a word that was exactly right and legally specific. Inadvisable. Inadvisable, she repeated. The party wishes to make clear that there are consequences, personal and financial, that would attend any formal testimony or documented cooperation that you provide. He met her eyes. The party's preference is that you decline any cooperation agreement currently under discussion and remove yourself from proximity to these proceedings entirely. This would be in your best interest. The wind moved down the block and she felt it on her face and breathed it in and said nothing for a moment, just held his gaze and let the silence do its work. And somewhere 20 feet behind her, Elena Vasquez's recording device was catching every syllable with the patient, comprehensive appetite of the law for self-incrimination. "Who is the party?" she said. "I'm not in a position to—" "Adrian Cross," she said. "That's who retained you. That's who paid you to stand on this street and deliver this message to a federal witness." She paused. "I need you to tell me that, directly." Something moved in Hale's face. The first crack in the professional neutrality, a brief recalibration. He had done this long enough to understand when a situation had shifted beneath him. His eyes moved once to the right, once to the left, the involuntary environmental check of a man who is reassessing the field. "I'm not going to be confirming the identity of my client," he said carefully. The professional neutrality had returned, but with a slightly different quality. Thinner, working harder. "You've already confirmed it," she said. The message was specific enough. The timing corresponds to Mr. Cross being served this morning. The phrase, "federal proceedings," narrows the client pool to one. She looked at him steadily. "You've just made Adrian Cross's federal situation significantly worse, Mr. Hale. And I think you know that." A long silence. 6, 7 seconds. Hale looked at her with the expression of a professional man who has just understood that he is standing in a specific type of situation and is rapidly calculating his optimal path through it. Then his eyes moved to the right again and stayed there for a half-second longer, which meant he had found Elena, which meant his calculation had just completed. "I'd advise you," he said quietly, "to get a lawyer." "I have one," she said. "Get your own." Hale looked at her for one more moment. Then he stepped back, one step, and turned, and walked north on the block at the same unremarkable pace he had arrived with, and rounded the corner and was gone. Elena was beside her in 30 seconds. "I have all of it," she said. She had her phone in her hand, recording application still running, the timer at 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Her face was focused, the pure operational focus of a woman whose entire long game had just produced its most important single piece of evidence. The reference to federal proceedings, the threat of personal consequences to a cooperating witness, the timing connecting it to today's service. "It's clean, Cassandra. It's exactly what we needed." Cassandra breathed out slowly. The cold air, the ordinary block, the ordinary afternoon light, the stroller woman who had looped back and was coming up the far side of the street again without any awareness of what had just happened in her neighborhood. "File it today," Cassandra said, "within the hour." Elena paused. Her phone was still in her hand. She looked at it, then at Cassandra, and something crossed her face. Something that was not operational, not tactical, simply human and complicated and without resolution. "After I file this, we're not going to see each other again. Not for a long time. Probably not after." She said it flatly, not as a grievance, as a statement of logistics. "The federal review, the restructuring of my cooperation, the distance required between my testimony and your husband's operation." "I know," Cassandra said. Elena nodded. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at Cassandra one last time with the full weight of 2 years in her face, the professional architecture of it, and beneath that the thing that had been real, the parts that couldn't be retroactively unrealed by the knowledge of how they had been built. "You're going to be fine," she said. It came out rough. "Not because of anything I did, because of who you were under all of it. I saw that from the first night. That part was never strategy." Cassandra looked at her. "I know," she said. And she did. That was the most painful and most accurate thing about Elena Vasquez, that the genuine parts had been real and had been used and both of those things were permanently and inseparably true. Elena turned and walked east and did not look back. Lucien was beside her a moment later. She didn't look at him immediately. She looked at the corner where Elena had turned and thought about all the things you couldn't undo. Not with regret, not with anger, just with the clear-eyed inventory of someone who was done pretending that the cost of the life she'd chosen was less than it was. The cost was real. The damage was real. What she had lost, what had been taken, what she had given away without knowing she was giving it, all of it was real. And she was not going to flatten it into a lesson or a trophy or a clean narrative of triumph. It was just the price. And she had looked at the price and decided to pay it because the alternative was standing in the rain forever with no coat. Lucien put his hand at her back. She felt the warmth of it. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. "Hale will give up Adrian by tonight. He has no reason to protect the client relationship if the client's conduct is already documented." "His lawyer will call mine before midnight," Lucien agreed. "Adrian will be re-indicted on the obstruction charge within the week. With Bale's cooperation and this, he has no viable defense." She paused. "He should plead." "He probably won't," Lucien said. "Men like Adrian Cross don't plead. They believe until the very last moment that something will intervene." "I know," she said. "I lived with that belief for 12 years. Watching it operate." She breathed in. It was exhausting. He was quiet beside her. The afternoon light was doing what November afternoon light did in New York, turning gold briefly, impossibly, before the gray closed back over it, a daily reminder that beauty was not canceled by impermanence, but was in fact constructed by it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Your 3 exposure points, in the Cayman architecture." He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. "Now?" "While I'm thinking clearly." She looked up at him. "The pass-through entity on the second tier uses a registered agent whose name appears in 2 of the documents Elena provided. Replace the agent, restructure the beneficial ownership through a different Caribbean jurisdiction, and make sure the new structure has no connection to any entity that appears in the existing federal documentation." Así está. She paused. "The third point is more complex. You'll need someone who can work inside the structure without appearing connected to it. Not Dario, someone with clean hands and no documented history with your operation." He looked at her. "You are describing yourself." "I'm describing the category," she said carefully. "I'm not available for that role at the moment. I have federal adjacent visibility that makes me the wrong instrument for at least the next 18 months. She paused. "But after that, the question is open." The corner of his mouth moved. The almost smile that she had cataloged, over months, as one of the most specific and unperformable things about him. The involuntary variety that arrived before his control could intercept it. "After 18 months, he said. "The question is open," she said again. They walked back through the West Village in the late afternoon light, Dario ahead and Mara somewhere in the surrounding geometry and the city doing its indifferent Saturday business around them, and Cassandra felt the specific quality of the walk, unhurried, the cold on her face, the contact of Lucien's arm against hers as they moved, as something she wanted to register fully rather than process and move past. She had spent too much of her life processing and moving past. She was done with that as a primary mode of existence. She thought about what remained. There was still a great deal that remained. The federal proceedings would take months. The obstruction charge against Adrian would generate noise, press coverage, the particular circus of a prominent man's public legal destruction, the ambient cruelty of a story that had her name in it and could not be prevented from becoming the version of her that strangers consumed in headlines. She would need to prepare for that. She would need Rice's help to manage it. She would need to decide, for the first time in her adult life, how she wanted to be publicly known rather than accepting the version that other people had assigned her. She thought about the townhouse. She had been living in it like a temporary arrangement, refusing to inhabit it fully, as if full habitation would commit her to a version of her life she hadn't yet decided to accept. She was done with that. She was going to paint the walls. She was going to choose the color without consulting anyone. She was going to put things in the rooms that were hers, not what remained from the cross years, not what had been assigned or selected for role, but things she actually wanted in the spaces she actually lived in. She thought about her Columbia degree, sitting in its archival box in the back of a closet because she had spent 12 years being decorative in rooms where economic training would have given her real leverage. She thought about the specific financial intelligence she had developed over 11 months of working in Lucien's world. The structural understanding, the pattern recognition, the ability to read the architecture of money with the same fluency she now read rooms. She thought about what those things could do in combination. She did not yet have a specific answer, but the shape of the question was visible, and it was, for the first time, exciting rather than terrifying. Her own question, her own shape. Nobody else's brief. She thought about her mother. She thought about calling her, not to report, not to seek approval, but simply to speak to the woman who had raised her with cold precision and had produced, perhaps despite herself, someone who knew how to survive the loss of everything and build something truer from the remains. She would probably call. Maybe. The relationship was what it was. But she was no longer carrying the interior voice, the one that had been her mother's and had become her own, the one that diminished in advance of any external diminishment. That voice had gone quiet somewhere in the past 11 months, faded out beneath the louder and more accurate voice of someone who had looked at the full measure of her own capability and decided to stop apologizing for it. They reached the townhouse, the stoop where Lucien had been sitting that morning, which felt, with the compression that intense days produced, like something from a different calendar entirely. Dario stopped at the bottom of the steps. Mara had dissolved back into the city's fabric. The block was quiet. Cassandra stopped at the foot of the stoop and looked at the townhouse facade. The brick, the windows, the door she had walked through and out of and back through so many times in the past 11 months without ever fully committing to what was behind it. She looked at it now with the specific eyes of someone who had just spent a year rebuilding themselves from the wall studs out and was standing in front of their own structure and finding it, for the first time, livable. She turned to Lucien. "Come inside," she said. But this time, she paused, found the sentence. "This time, it's because I want you here, not because of what's next or what needs to be managed or what the next 48 hours require. Just because." She held his gaze. "That needs to be said clearly, between us." He looked at her for a moment. The full, undivided attention, the scar, the dark eyes that had learned, somewhere in the past 11 months, to stop being entirely a control mechanism and start being simply a way of looking at her. "Yes," he said. "It needed to be said clearly. And you understand that I'm not inside your operation," she said. "Not now, possibly not ever, depending on how the next years go. You don't get me as an asset. You get me as—" She paused again. The sentence was hard to finish, not because she didn't know what it contained, but because she had spent 37 years not permitting herself to finish sentences of this category out loud. As someone who is here because she chose to be, on her own terms, with the full picture. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't want an asset." He said it simply, without decoration. "I had assets for 20 years. I know exactly what they are, and what they cost, and what they can't give you at 11:45 at night when the coffee is cold." He held her gaze. "I want the woman who stood on that street this afternoon," without shaking. "I was shaking," she said, "on the inside." "I know," he said. "That's the part that matters." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold afternoon light of a November Saturday on a quiet street in the West Village, and felt the full weight of everything that had brought her to this specific stoop. The rain, the papers, the marble island, the ring placed beside the whiskey glass, the bar on Lexington, Elena's business card, the months of reconstruction, the dinner on the Upper West Side, the auction, the lounge, the 48 hours, the corner of Bank and Greenwich, the long cold walk back through a city that had not changed at all, and in which she had changed completely. She felt all of it not as a burden and not as a triumph, but simply as the accumulated material of a life, dense, specific, irreducible, entirely her own. Then she went up the stoop and opened the door. Lucien followed her inside. The townhouse received them with the particular quiet of a space waiting to be fully inhabited. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook she had installed 6 months ago and never moved. She walked to the kitchen and filled the kettle and set it on the stove. She looked at the kitchen table, the table where she had sat at 3 in the morning with a glass of water she didn't drink. The table where she and Lucien had talked for 2 hours and rebuilt something from the rubble of what Elena had detonated. And she pulled out a chair and sat down in it, and felt the solid reality of the chair beneath her, and the kitchen around her, and the city outside the windows doing its permanent, indifferent, inexhaustible thing. Lucien sat across from her. Not with the lawyer's papers, not with a phone, not with any of the operational machinery of the life they had been conducting in this kitchen for months. Just sitting. Two people at a kitchen table in the early dark of a November evening. The kettle began its slow build toward boiling. Outside, Manhattan continued. It always continued. It was the one thing about the city that had never required anything from her. Not performance, not management, not the careful architectural maintenance of someone else's vision of who she was. It just continued, indifferent and brilliant and full of the permanent human noise of 8 million people conducting the irreducible business of their own lives. She had hated that indifference once, when she was the woman walking in the rain with nowhere to go. Now she understood it differently. The city's indifference was not cold. It was clean. It asked nothing and offered everything and left the question of who you were and what you built entirely, ruthlessly, and without appeal to you. She reached across the table and turned her hand palm up. Lucien looked at it for a moment. Then he placed his hand in hers. She looked at the ring on her finger, the ring that had fit exactly from the first moment, which had told her something specific about the kind of man he was, and which still told her the same thing, and which she had not removed in the weeks since he'd placed it there and did not intend to remove. Not because of what it represented to the room at the Black Orchid Auction. Not because of what it had communicated to Adrian Cross in a velvet-lit ballroom, while his face went white and his empire was already beginning its slow structural collapse, but because it was hers. It was a thing she had chosen with the full picture in front of her, and at the cost of understanding exactly what the choice contained. She thought about the woman who had stood at the kitchen island and signed her name in silence. She thought about what she would tell that woman if the geometry of time permitted it. Not comfort, because that woman didn't need comfort. She needed information. She needed someone to look her in the eye and tell her the truth without managing the delivery. She thought she would tell her this, that the loss of everything is not the end of everything. That the structure you build after the collapse is the real structure, the one made from your actual materials rather than the ones assigned to you. That the worst night of your life is not the worst thing. That what comes after the worst night depends entirely on whether you are willing to walk into it without a coat and keep going. She thought the woman at the island would have found this insufficient. She thought that was fine. Insufficient information was what most people had when they made the choices that defined them. You worked with what you had. You kept moving. You paid what you owed, claimed what was yours, and told the truth, at least to yourself, at least in the end. And that was the entirety of what you could do, and it turned out, more often than not, to be enough. The kettle reached its boil and clicked off, and the steam rose from it and drifted across the kitchen in the warm yellow light, and outside the dark settled over Manhattan, and the city lit itself as it always did. 10,000 windows, the grit of it, the permanent human insistence on remaining visible in the dark. And Cassandra Vale sat at her kitchen table with her hand in Lucien Moretti's hand and was, at last, entirely present in her own life. Not triumphant, not healed, not finished with the cost of any of it, just here, awake, undiminished, herself.